The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody. This is Lynn Strand, and I'm your division chair of the CI division. Welcome to our webinar, Learn Strategic Insights from Your Competitors' Customers with Sean Campbell. We'd like to thank Aurora WDC for hosting our webinar today. Before we start, I've got a couple of housekeeping items. For those of you who are on the phone, your lines will be muted. Please ask questions in the Q&A window, and we'll address them in the middle and at the end of the webinar. This webinar is being recorded, and a slide deck will be provided, so thank you for taking the opportunity to catch this presentation live. Please feel free to use social media during is #SLACID. Sean's Twitter handle is @Sean_Campbell. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Sean has been the CEO of Cascade Insights since 2006. Prior to that, he successfully grew and sold his first company, 3Leaf. Whenever time permits, Sean enjoys sharing best practices and tips with business professionals on topics such as professional services firm leadership, marketing tactics and strategies, market research, and competitive intelligence as a discipline. To date, he has had the opportunity to speak at over 250 plus industry events, published 3 books, 2 for Microsoft and 1 for Intel, 1 ebook, Going Beyond Google, and a plethora of articles and blog posts in addition to being the host of the B2B Market Research podcast. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sean.
Excellent. Thanks for that intro too, by the way. Yep. So the presentation today is focused on insights from competitor customers. And so we're going to go through a series of questions that we have used to very good effect over the lifetime of running projects that target competitor customers. And we'll get to that in a minute. That was such a nice intro. I don't really have a lot to add here, except to maybe add that I'm a happy husband, a dad of 2 boys, and I have a Labrador puppy. That's probably the only thing that didn't quite make it into the bio. As mentioned, I'm the host of the B2B Market Research podcast. We're fortunate enough to be in the top 10 for B2B podcasts in iTunes, and that's been a lot of fun to run. So my perspective, this is really, really important to get out of the way first. We are a specialist firm, and I can strongly advocate for that. I'm not a big fan of generalists. So my examples are going to come from the work that we've done, which is what you should expect of anybody. So I'm going to give you a lot of examples that come from the tech sector when I talk about how we've maybe used these questions. That's fine, though, because the questions that I'm going to give you can actually be applied, and I know people have applied them to other industries and verticals and whatever. So from that perspective, a lot of what we're going to cover are questions that can be used in a B2B context. And so that's kind of the perspective I'm coming with. This is a partial client list at the moment, so like this gives you kind of a sense of kind of who we typically work for and the context that I might have when I'm kind of bringing these questions up. So first, though, we're going to start with a live poll. And I'm going to show you how to get to the poll in a second, but I want to set some context on it first. So let's talk a little bit about where you get competitive intelligence insights from. Now, I realize in any survey there could be 16 options, right? But I wanted to focus on these for a few particular reasons that we'll get to. So first, do you get it from internal human intelligence sources, from your own customers, your own employees? Do you get it from external human intelligence sources? Do you get it from competitor customers, let's say, okay, or partners or third parties otherwise? Do you get it from web search? A lot of people leverage, techniques like that. We covered that in the Going Beyond Google book that we published for a few years. Then there's syndicated research. I'm not a huge fan of syndicated research, but it does have its place. So how do you participate in the poll? Well, all you have to do, you can do this on a mobile or a tablet or a laptop, so no excuses. As long as you're holding something with a screen and a CPU and a web browser, you can get to this. Go to menti.com and type in the code, and then it'll present you your choices, and you can go put them in, and it'll update it dynamically. I'm not asking for emails. There's no collection of information, nothing. I don't have any idea who you are, okay, so you don't have to worry about that. But I do want to see folks kind of submit these, because what we're going to be able to get is a little bit of a sense from the audience as to kind of where you get your competitive intelligence. I've actually used this tool when I've spoken at the SCIP conference and a few other places. It's a pretty neat little tool. So I'll just give you a few seconds to go put in some votes. Again, you just go to menti.com, MENTI.com, and you use the code 353320 when you get there. And we have our first vote, second vote. And for somewhat obvious reasons, we'll move off this after a little while, but I want to give it a second or two for the votes to come in. It's always tempting to want to comment on the results as they come in, kind of like watching folks talk about election night, but you want to wait till all the results are in. So I'd love to say something about where the bars are right now, but let's wait till we get a few more votes and see if this holds. So somewhat consistently, though, the internet, I'm willing to take an early prediction. The internet tends to stay up here at the top. Not entirely surprisingly, external human intelligence is at the bottom, and there's a concrete reason for that I want to get to in a minute. Give it about one more minute here and see if we get a few more votes, but things have held relatively true through this. Okay, so it looks good. So basically, the internet sits up at the top. Nope, there's one more that just popped in. Internal human intelligence, pretty much tied with syndicated research, and then external human intelligence at the bottom. It's worth noting that until I move off this, you'll still be able to actually vote. So as I go through the next couple slides before we get to our second poll, feel free to continue to vote at that link if you have it up. And we'll see if there's any additional votes when we come back. So anyway, that's kind of how the audience, at least today, tends to line up. And I think the reason why finding external human intelligence is considered hard is because, well, it is harder than talking to other things. But I'd also like to say it's not impossible. So hence kind of the no whiners flag here. This is something that's actually achievable. So let's switch over and talk about how you actually find competitor customers. So if you're looking specifically at competitor customers now, what are the ways that you find them? And so I'm going to put this poll up in a second. Obviously, some people use CRM data because you'll have lost data in your CRM, and you'll be able to say, well, that customer, to the best of our knowledge, chose the competition, so we're going to go off and talk to them, and that's a tried and true method. Quant surveys. Sometimes people will send out fairly large-scale quant surveys to find out who's bought from the competition. And in any market where maybe you're vendor number one and they're vendor number two, in terms of preference and choice, it's probably likely that they considered you at some point along the way. So that's one way to think of them as a competitor customer. Some people mine LinkedIn. We'll talk about that. Some people mine job postings. We'll talk a little bit about that here before we get into the questions. And then mining competitor case studies and mining forums and third-party communities are also somewhat popular. So with that in mind, I'm going to go back here and we're going to move on to the next poll. So this is how do you identify competitor customers. You can essentially refresh that page, go back to the original link. It's now going to show this question. And we'll start to get some data here in a second or two. So again, same process as before. Just go to menti.com, enter the code. If you're already on the page, you can refresh it or navigate to it in another tab, so forth. So we've got a few votes in already. It's really interesting to see how much this is dancing around. We'll see if CRM data stays at the top. It tends to have been there longer than most things. Quant surveys, I'm not entirely surprised to see them at the bottom. They tend to be one of the more expensive ways to solve this problem. Sometimes it's the only way, though, just given what you might be dealing with in terms of a market dynamic. All right, so I want to make sure we have enough time with the questions, so do keep voting. I'm going to share these out via Twitter, the screenshots of the survey results once the presentation's over, sometime a little bit later today. And again, just the results themselves, I have no ability to know exactly who was voting which way or anything like that. So I guess we'll stop here in terms of analyzing it just briefly. CRM data is up at the top. It's one of the easier things to access. Mining LinkedIn comes up a pretty close second, and we'll explain why, and then we've got the rest of the stuff ranked out down below. So how do you find them? Why do I say there's no whiners? Well, the reality is LinkedIn alone, as was somewhat evident by the survey results, LinkedIn is a fantastic place to find folks. And you can even say, to a lesser degree, the same thing about Twitter, because what you have in both cases is people are essentially telling the world, this is what I'm interested in, this is what I'm passionate about. In Twitter, it's a little more loosely coupled because you have to infer more from obviously a limited amount of text that can be shared on Twitter, either in the person's bio or via individual tweets. But a perfect example there of using Twitter bios, because folks may be somewhat familiar with LinkedIn. It's very common to look through someone's professional resume of sorts on LinkedIn and say, you have experience with XYZ technology, or you've done ABC type of business process, and so then you can collect those people and then go reach out to them. But on Twitter, a lot of times if someone's a fan of a particular product, they might put something even in their bio, as limited as the text is there. For example, Tableau Software has a program called the Zen Master program. It's not the most inventive name, let's say, but it's what they call their people who are essentially their most valued customers, who do a lot of kind of cross-training and community development with other Tableau users. And so for one project we were on, we were able to go through and look at actual Twitter bios and just find that there was a number of people who just said they were Tableau Zen Masters. And right there you have not only a fairly big advocate for Tableau, you're almost guaranteed to talk to somebody who knows a lot about the product. As with all research, you have to realize the bias that's going to be there. And I won't keep repeating that as we talk about this. Just, recognize that there will be differing degrees of bias you'll have to work out. That's kind of my public service announcement. So, the bias here is obviously that on Twitter, in that case, you're talking to somebody who might not see a lot of warts in Tableau, but maybe what you want to hear is from the raving fans of Tableau. Maybe that's your point. So, long story told, those are two great places to go. Another great place is to actually look at job postings. Now, this is a little bit more directional, but it can point you toward an organization and types of organizations who have a preference for buying a certain product. So what you see here is actually a job trends graph from Indeed. And so what we put in here is HubSpot, Marketo, and Infusion. Those are three products that roughly compete with each other in the same space. Marketo was a recent acquisition, but we're looking here historic data, so it's fine to just look at Marketo directly. And what you can see here pretty rapidly is that Marketo has a lot more job postings open for it. Now that's interesting statistical data, but what I find interesting for finding competitor customers is looking at the job postings, because in many cases, particularly in the technology industry, but it's true in other industries, I've had people tell me this, they use job postings to look for like certifications that maybe line up with a competitor offering. There's a lot of indicators that a company is using a certain set of products and solutions, because they have to ask for skill with those when they hire people to perform jobs at that company. And so it's incredibly common to see this kind of stuff in job postings. It's a little more indirect, of course, because you don't have the individual who's going to do those, but it does help you maybe filter results on LinkedIn, maybe you go after those companies in specific. Another great place to go is case studies. I truly say that you should never actually interview the first person quoted, and I mean that only slightly tongue-in-cheek. The first person quoted in a case study of your competitor is likely not necessarily the person who did the most evaluation. I find this so consistent, it's almost laughable. They went for the person who was the best title. So for example, if a solution is sold to marketers, the CMO will have a quote in the study, the client organization CMO. It's probably somewhat likely that that quote was almost written for them and then they approved it. That sometimes happens. But lower down in the case study, sometimes on page 2, there'll be someone with a much less honorific title, and that person, maybe the director of marketing or the director of email marketing or something like that, is probably the person who knows the most about the solution and how it's used day to day. So short tip on case studies, skip to page 2 or look for the second quote. Another great place to go is community forums. This you could spend a whole amount of time on just by itself. In this day and age, there's a community, whether sponsored by your competitor or by a third party, about almost any product intersection you could think about these days. So, you know, if you're a frequent flyer and you want to figure out what airline has the best kind of options and points, you should go to Flyer Talk, where they have huge forums aligned with each and individual every airline in existence. And so I'm showing you here basically the Moz forum, just to stick with this kind of marketing products example that I was using. And so, you know, the thing to keep in mind is you want to steer around, you know, staff, as shown here, right? You know, you wouldn't want to necessarily reach out to a staff member directly. So you don't have to worry about that. I have people say sometimes, well, what if their staff reaches out? Well, a lot of times the badges that people have in the community, it just says they're a staff member of your competitor, so don't reach out to them. But on the other hand, there's also badges that'll show maybe that someone is a very popular member of the community and they are an individual user and they've been answering a lot of questions about the product for an extended period of time. I don't know why you wouldn't want to talk to that person. They probably know not only the positives, but a lot of the warts, because they're trying to help answer those questions. There was a project we did once where we surfaced 14 people in a Friday afternoon, basically, and got about 10 interviews out of one customer support forum. And they were all great interviews because they were just the exact right people. As with all of these web assets, one capstone comment before we move on is that you do have to look at the terms of service for these platforms. They will allow and disallow certain types of activity. And so, you know, that also goes specifically for even kind of wholly owned communities like a support forum. So just make sure that what you're doing is allowed. It shouldn't be all that difficult to figure out. And in many cases, it is allowed, at least the examples that we were talking about so far. Finally, there's a plethora of CRM solutions. This, you know, particular grid from G2 Crowd just shows you just one example of the number of CRM solutions that are out there today. There's probably at least 20 on that grid on the right. And so mining your CRM data is great. As most folks perhaps know on the call, it does come with some constraints. I don't know how many times we've gotten CRM data from a client and the emails are bad, or we reach out to people and they say, well, I didn't really even think about your company that much in terms of our client's company. I very rapidly went to someone else. Sometimes the competitors listed improperly. You know, there's all kinds of things. I mean, salespeople, generally speaking, aren't considered data scientists, so they're not going to necessarily be as rigid about putting in the data. And there are certainly processes you can put in place to help support that. But in the end, this data is going to get a little fuzzy around the edges, but it can be useful. So CRM data is another place to go. Now let's roll into the questions, because first I wanted to set some grade on, like, well, can we find these competitor customers? And the answer is yes, so no whining from that standpoint. We find competitor customers all the time. But what are some of the questions you can ask once you're on with them? Well, before we get into that, I want to say that every single one of these questions we're going to go through is something that we've used on real-world projects that Fortune 500s have paid for. And every single one of these questions have generated results that stakeholders have appreciated. It's not about us. It's just about proving that these aren't questions that kind of just, you know, came out of the ether. These were pulled directly from actual discussion guides and pieces of work that we have done. I've obviously scrubbed out, like, client names and product names and whatever. I've kind of generalized the question somewhat, but not in a way that actually hurts its applicability. So just keep in mind that every one of these questions, whether you might use it specifically in your line of business or your industry, that'll vary a little bit. But every one of these we've used to really good effect. So the first question is, which features are customers using more than expected? It's a very easy question to jump over too fast, especially if your project is being driven, let's say, by product engineering. It's a blind spot sometimes. They don't like to ask this question. Again, this is of competitor customers, right? Because engineering likes to look at the spec of the competitor's product and the spec of theirs, and they almost have this kind of bias to think, well, it's kind of all being used, or they're using the features that are in our product the most by mirroring. And you need to ask, now that they've had the product for a while, what are they using more than expected? And that leads you to a couple different insights. One, it could be your next killer feature to copy. It could be the next thing you need to really focus on as a company. The other thing is, it helps you when dealing with a development team in pushing back on them somewhat, so that you actually have some ammo to say, you know, I know you want to mirror against this feature, but this is actually the feature over here that customers really have fallen in love with over time, even if they found other warts in the competitor's solution. So it's a great question to ask. What features are you using more now that you've had the product for an extended period of time? A related and perhaps even slightly more important question is, what features were considered a key reason for purchase but the organization isn't using them? And this can be a tough one to ask. You don't want to like start off the interview with a competitor customer asking this. It'll probably put them on the defensive too much. But at some point, once they feel that they've justified their decision and talked about it in ways that makes them feel comfortable, you can throw this one in, because there's no product on the planet that has equal use of features once it's been deployed for a while. Once it meets the needs of the organization, some of that's going to change. And the reason this is helpful is multifaceted. One, it helps get you to a place of understanding if there's a degree of buyer remorse. Maybe they bought the solution and it was touted for 10 features and they're only using 2 of them. Now, you can't draw a straight line on ROI. You can't say, well, they're only happy with 2/10 of what they paid at that point. That's not true. You don't necessarily know that at that point. But you do know that they were sold that they had 10 capabilities they would love, and they're only really using 6. Okay, well, that's going to create some degree of buyer remorse, and you can use that if you're trying to remain competitive. It also helps you to not chase competitor features that don't matter, right? It's so easy, and we see this on project after project, where somebody says to us at the start, I really want you to ask about these 4 features. These are really important. We think that this is a big deal in the competitor's feature stack. We find the customers aren't using them. Because there's always going to be a difference between how your competitor talks up features and how their customer base uses those features. And you want to be able to separate those 2 things. You don't want to be blinded by their marketing, and so that you think that that particular feature or capability has been used when it's really not all that common. Another great question to ask, what functionality was lacking in the solution that customers ultimately chose? And this is one that can, again, be one that's sometimes left to the side. It's like, well, they made a good decision, you know, we should assume that, blah, blah, blah. You can't do that. There were people that even bought Windows phones. I'm not really sure why they bought Windows phones, but they did. And I could actually guess some of the reasons they might have. Frankly, customers don't always choose the best. Every market has cheap solutions, expensive solutions. That may be for financial reasons they've done it. It may just be because they're just extremely conservative and pragmatic, and they just kind of like cheap, right? They might overlook flaws for future returns. I don't think we could make this argument about Windows Phone, but we could essentially make this argument about other things. They may have gone off and bought something that's deficient in a certain way. You know, take a look at augmented reality, virtual reality headsets. A lot of these have some deficiencies these days, but people are buying them in an attempt to kind of see as early adopters what the capabilities might be. So, you know, that's a bit of a future returns kind of bet. They're not going to buy necessarily the best, you know, input device, because the AR headset may not be the best way to input at this point, but essentially it does provide unique capabilities that are forward-looking. Or perhaps it's part of a larger platform that they truly love. This is probably the most logical reason why some people bought Windows Phone. They may have actually truly liked the Windows ecosystem. They felt like this was kind of something that was likely to succeed. In some ways, it might be a combination of number 2 and number 3 on this slide. They were hoping that Microsoft would get their act together and sell more phones, and maybe they were big Windows fans. And they might have gotten discounts, or it might have been a package deal, or just had integrations and hooks that they found valuable, and hence they were willing to use Windows Phone. Another great example here from the Microsoft landscape is SharePoint. I don't think anyone's ever taken SharePoint willingly into their organization, but for a number of years, Microsoft gave away licenses to that product. I mean, functionally gave them away as part of enterprise license agreements. This is a known public fact. It happened 10 years ago. And so that gave them the fuel to essentially say, hey, we know this portal product isn't super great, but you know, Mr. IT manager, you're going to get free licenses to it, and you already use all this other Microsoft stuff. And it allowed SharePoint to dominate, even though its capabilities weren't that great compared to some of its competitors. And even today, to some degree, that's still true. in terms of the capabilities deficiencies. So another great question to dig into, is there a new buyer persona? So commonly companies get their start by really understanding a certain type of customer. They know them intimately, they know how to sell to them, they know how to engage with them, they know how to build products for them. And all of a sudden, the market changes or the method of purchase changes, and now there's a different type of buyer, and you don't really know how to sell to that buyer. It's worse, of course, if the competitor has chosen to sell to that buyer and you haven't. It's a well-known public fact, noted across hundreds, if not thousands of articles, that Salesforce did a really good job choosing to sell to the business unit. They didn't necessarily sell their product to IT managers and technical staff. They sold it to sales leads, marketing leads, people who essentially weren't technical. And you see this over and over and over again in certain SaaS solutions that are sold today. Obviously, the solutions that came before were sold to a large extent to central IT, and so there was a different buyer persona in play. It also can sometimes be that just they sell up the stack and you sell below. Some of you are aware of the Dell EMC merger that's happening. If you know anything in general about how those companies have gone to market over the years, Dell has been much more kind of a mid-level IT manager sale, much as this Microsoft did for a number of years, actually. And EMC, typically a little more known for kind of an IBM-like selling model. They tried to go really high, would talk to C-level, senior people. So now you have even two cultures merging that have, very different sales motions in a way. And that's even happening inside a company, much less how it can happen when you're contrasting your motion with a competitor. So you need to ask, well, who do you actually sell to? What kind of buyer are you? That kind of thing. Another area to probe, and this is a growing area across a lot of industries, it's particularly true in tech, is this move from solutions that required an upfront cost or essentially kind of a fixed license of sorts to a model where you can have freemium access to the solution for an extended period of time. And probing this kind of sales motion, given it's growing, is becoming ever critical. And there's actually a couple angles to this that we're going to get into in some other questions in a little bit. But one question to look at is what moves a user from free to paid? That's a really key question to ask, because if the selling model starts out with free and then moves to paid, you'll want to know what drives that kind of engagement. A lot of the MarTech solutions, if you've heard that phrase before, there's about 4,000 different solutions in the MarTech infographics that float out there. And these are things that do email marketing or ad management or help with SEO and things like that. All of those pretty much have some kind of freemium tier that you can access. So you want to know what helps move a user from free to paid. And in many cases, it's not a traditional sales motion, it's more of a marketing motion. It's more of using content marketing and digital assets to move people from a free tier to a paid tier. And on one hand, you could say, well, it only matters if they paid, but that's not true, because the fuel is those free customers as they try to convert them. So if you're analyzing somebody who's using this type of motion, it's really important to kind of not just look at the free to paid, but to look at how marketing and sales interact to move people across that chasm. Another great question to look at is, was the transition from sales to implementation smooth? Many studies that we've done, I can think of one for a particular SaaS provider who targeted payment processing. We really looked at this and found that one of their competitors had done a horrible job basically with the implementation phase. In other words, selling was fine. The product actually had certain capabilities, and those even were borne out. But the implementation, just the work it took to use the solution over time, was challenging. So things you want to probe here are, maybe the challenge was that the organization switched implementation to partners. We did a study once that looked at mission critical apps used by like Fortune 50 banks and large organizations. And I remember a quote somebody said once that stuck with me for years. He said, I actually liked the solution your client provided better than the one I bought. I liked the capabilities better, I liked everything. And I said, well, and he even liked the price. And I said, well, why didn't you buy it then, in essence? And he said, I didn't trust the partners, because I knew that for the next 3 years, I was going to be dealing with the partner network of that organization, who had a better product, but a much poorer partner network. And so in the end, I would be living with the partner, he said, for the next 3 years. I wouldn't necessarily be living with the client organization who sold me the product. And this kind of dynamic exists in a lot of industries. Sometimes payment hurdles alone can be an issue. For a very long time, although this has somewhat been rectified, some of AWS's competitors actually had significant problems just with payment. So a lot of these other kind of cloud infrastructure programs, products, had challenges when it came to making it obvious to users of these platforms what their billing was going to be for the month. Now, you think that should be fairly elemental, but it was one of those big challenges. So there was a lot of opportunity, I think, generally speaking, for certain people in the space to win out just on the means of payment and how easy it was to kind of just track billing and access to the solution. So don't forget even simple stuff on the procurement side. Another question, did the implementation go poorly? The reason I want to come back to this one with a slightly different look is this is where you get win-back opportunities. So if you know the implementation went poorly, you really want to dive into that, because not only because you're going to get that customer to win back, because that's not the purpose of research. I mean, research isn't lead gen. It's not like you do research and then you give the list of companies to your client and then they go after them. That's not what research is. What you're going for, though, is you're going for a certain archetype of client that then they can identify the scenarios that create poor implementations in a competitor customer base. They can look at whether integration was the issue, a host of things, and then they can build even marketing campaigns and sales campaigns that have exactly the right messaging to go after those customers. How and when were partners involved in the sales process? We talked about partners being involved in the implementation, but sometimes partners are involved in the sales process, and they can either be a hindrance or an accelerant. So don't assume that the sales process of your competitor is using just full-time employees. In certain industries, the partner, the reseller, the distributor basically leads the sales cycle, and you should put the bulk of your research efforts there. It's analyzing how they sell that's more important than the competitor's name. Partners will also fix product and solution holes. So another thing to think about when you look at the selling process is, if you sometimes might think, well, I'm losing out to this competitor and I don't understand why, because they don't really have a lot of capabilities. It's not atypical to have partner solutions brought in alongside that solution. And sometimes it's the combination of the two that really sold the company on your competitor. So when they say they're in love with the competitor product during an interview, it's helpful to say, are there other solutions you use in conjunction with this? Are there solutions that you purchased to kind of really make this greater than the sum of its parts? That kind of line of thinking is what you want to get into. Next, how are customers measuring and validating a successful deployment? This is another really big area to probe, and it's so often missed. The assumption is, well, if they tell me they were happy, that means they were happy. But you want to dig into this for a lot of reasons, because you want to get to the success metrics that individual buyer personas were focused on. Someone in a business unit may have a very different set of success metrics than someone who's more technical, or someone who's in procurement, or someone who's in finance, right? So knowing that can help arm your marketing teams, it can help arm your product development teams, it can help arm your sales teams. You also get some information here about, was the message cost reduction versus return on investment? Maybe you focus on cost reduction and the other guy focuses on return of investment. This is very typical in most markets. Upstarts will tend to, not always, focus on like a cost reduction, like our solution is cheap and it's efficient and it's fast and it has limited features, but it's great because it's not going to cost you much. Whereas larger established companies who have very complex solutions to offer the market, they'll talk about the overall return on investment and the total cost of ownership. So in the end, do you and the competition target the same metrics? That's really the key point you want to figure out here. How is support handled by the competition, and are customers happy with the results? This is another really, really big area to probe into. So commonly, especially for complex B2B solutions, maybe a little less so for kind of simple consumer solutions, the support can be a really big hang-up. Also, some companies today do a lot of self-service and community support, so you want to probe not just the support they offer as a paid option, but you also want to look at the degree and capability that their self-service and community-based options have. So The key thing here again was the support bad enough to create buyer's remorse. This leads you again to win-back opportunities. It leads you to clear insights about whether your own support team is actually a differentiator, and you should talk that up a little bit more. What was the pricing model versus the price point? This is another huge area. Very often people don't split these the way they should. They focus on just the price point. What did the solution cost? But as some of you probably are well aware, one of the greatest reasons that people choose infrastructure solutions in tech, cloud-based infrastructure solutions, is because of the transition of the cost structure from a capital expense to an operating expense. So the pricing model there almost trumps basically what the price point is. It's more the method of payment than the actual kind of price point. And so when we do studies, we try to separate the two things in the interviewee's mind. So like, what was the pricing model you paid, and also what was the price point? Then you do need to dig into how much of a factor the price point was in the purchasing decision. I can't count the number of times that somebody says to us in a study, it happens probably 50% of the time, this upstart competitor is rapidly discounting on every deal. They're just discounting to win the deals. They're just giving it away. There's some variation of that. I hear that probably 50% of the time when a client approaches us and I start asking him questions about the competitor. Hardly ever is it as true as they think it is. So you need to really dig into how much was the price point a factor in the decision making, because that may not have even driven the sale even if they were discounting. Maybe they bought it because they were early adopters making a bet. Maybe they were a little more conservative, to borrow from Jeffrey Moore here, right? And they really were looking for a good price point, and that did drive the deal. I mean, sometimes that may happen. And then, who are you and they selling to today in terms of kind of the price point affinity, and is it the same? So those are big things to look at. Does the customer foresee a time when they might outgrow the solution? Another great question to ask, especially toward the end of the interview, right? Because organizations sometimes grow. Maybe someday there'll be 2,000 employees versus 100. Or maybe they'll move from one central office to a worldwide network of staff. So knowing when you might have a re-engagement point with that particular account is really good too. And then again, trying to figure out an archetype of account that's worth going after, even if they've been with the competitor for a while, but now you should because they've grown or changed. Also, what of a competitor's sales motion should you analyze? You need to look at inside sales today. Inside sales is carrying a bigger weight than it ever did before. It's not the telemarketing of old. So you have to figure out if your competitor's inside sales team is driving a lot of the revenue and the engagement. Outside sales. Many companies still have a fairly sufficiently sized outside sales force, and trying to figure out not just what outside sales is doing, but how they're partnering with inside sales is something important to look at. And obviously, as well talked about, the buyer's journey has changed. Depending on what statistic you want to look at, the portion of the funnel that's basically driven by self-service research and marketing is somewhere 50% or greater. So you can't just look at sales as kind of a handshake-driven business anymore, even in complex B2B purchases. What portion of that sales motion can we emulate? Obviously, once you've done that analysis, a great question to ask yourself is, well, what can we emulate? What should we run the copy machine on? And that can be things like mimicking the type of personalities and hires and personas they have on the sales team. And it can also simply be mimicking the process. Sometimes your competitor legitimately has a better sales process than you, and you learn that by asking questions of competitor customers like we've gone through and figuring out what was that sales process really like. This is one of my favorite questions to ask. Did our client make the shortlist? So often our client presumes they're in most deals that they should be, and that's not always the case. A lot of times they'll be bounced out early. So you want to figure out what deals you should have been invited to but weren't. And by invited to, in this case, I mean like meaningfully invited to. You got to the short list, you had a real chance at competition. It's not just like they talked to your reps once. As this can let you know, are you making the RFP and the RFI list and you're getting a lot of early access to potential customers. You're getting early access to them, but you're not making it all the way through the funnel. And the only way you can really ask that is if you ask the customer that you're talking to and you really make them walk through the process of picking vendors, and you get them to lay out, well, which ones did you engage with only somewhat, and then you kind of left behind. This also relates to dead no decision research. This is one of the places where CRM data can actually be pretty helpful. If you do a specific project that targets just those entries in the CRM that show like no response, basically kind of just the lead timed out fairly quickly, there was only a limited amount of engagement, you can either do a quant survey or some type of in-depth interview approach to figure out, did most of those dead no decisions actually go to a competitor? When we've done it, we found that it's not atypical for what you've listed as a dead no decision, let's say, to, in 50% or greater of the cases, be actually a loss to a competitor. Because what you have there is, you were in the long list, you never made it to the short list, but they went ahead and actually bought a solution anyway. And then here's the bonus question, so going beyond 15. Knowing everything you know now, would you make the same decision? I think this is a great question because B2B purchasing models are a little different than B2C. Certainly in B2C, people justify the decision they've made. But it's even a little more so in B2B, in my opinion, because in B2B, this is a business person, this is their day job. They're not making a decision about something they use in their leisure time. They're trying to justify a decision that ties into their career and the knowledge that they're a smart individual doing a great job. And so it's very easy for somebody to kind of constantly justify the decision and not really give you a lot of angles to pick on when it comes to like, well, where was the decision making deficient? But if you've had a really good interview, this is the kind of question you can ask toward the end. And a lot of times they'll go back through their decision-making tree, and sometimes they'll even tell you they wouldn't have bought the product they bought, even if they've spent 50 minutes explaining why they should have and why it made sense. So it's a really, really great question to ask. Just make sure you ask it toward the end of the interview. All right. We'll open this up here to questions in a minute. In closing, we offer what I think is a pretty solid resource out there in the world of market research. We're the only dedicated podcast on B2B market research. We've got over 120 plus episodes. We're available on Stitcher and iHeartRadio and iTunes. And in addition, if you'd rather read than listen, our blog provides a rich, detailed article aligned with each and every podcast. And so you can go check that out on our blog, or you can sign up and listen to the podcast on a bunch of major vehicles for podcast listening. And with that, I just want to open it up to questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Sean. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. We're waiting to see if anybody's asking, but I've got a quick question about you talked a lot about the B2B. Obviously, that's your strong suit. Can you give us a little bit of a taste of how you might do some of this in a B2C type of market?
I'm going to say something that's probably a little surprising. I won't,
okay,
because I don't know it.
Okay.
I really, I'll leave that to the generalists who say they can do everything for anybody, but,
Right.
It's not an area I know really well. I could certainly make conjectures, and I think
Yeah.
the audience can kind of make logical conclusions, but I would say this, one of the things about it, just from observing what other B2C focused firms do, the biggest difference with any of this kind of research is the end. Meaning, in B2C, you can almost always default to some kind of quant survey, right? Because the N is always available to you, right? It's kind of a different type of dynamic that way. Whereas in B2B, the N usually starts at a number that statistically is below what would be smart to run a quant survey on, right?
Exactly.
And so you end up, which is also why you end up with a little more heavyweight qualitative balance. Like in the podcast, I talk a lot about qualitative methodology and a little less so about quant. Because frankly, even if your stakeholders are pushing you in B2B for quant, it's challenging to do that. I mean, certainly like most firms, you can derive a certain amount of quant from qual, even if it's cheating a little bit that way. You know what I mean? You shouldn't from the purist standpoint, but stakeholder says, you did 20 interviews. I'd like a pie chart. Okay, here's your pie chart.
Right.
So
right. Exactly.
there's, and you can do that with coding tools and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, it's a space to leave to somebody else because we're purely B2B focused.
Great, thank you. It doesn't look like anybody's got any questions today. You clearly just wowed them with all of this great information. So I would just like to say thank you once again, Sean, for joining us today, and also thank you to Aurora WDC for sponsoring the webinar. If you've got any questions, I'm sure that that Sean would be happy to answer them, and you could follow him on Twitter or check into his blog archives to see if your question might be there. And also, please make sure to join us for our next webinar on November 17th, which is Ethical Social Media Collection with Norm Wilhelm, who presented at SLA 2016. And with that, I shall say thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.